The most dangerous lie ever told about money is that money is the thing itself. It is not. Money is not the wheat. It is not the steel. It is not the land. It is not the labor. It is not the machine. It is not the house. It is not the food on your plate or the electricity in your walls or the hands that built the road outside your door. Money is the claim. Money is the permission slip. Money is the signal that tells society who gets access to real things and who must wait, work, beg, borrow, or go without. That is where I want to begin, because almost every bad conversation about wealth begins one step too late. People talk about money as if it were a natural substance, some limited mineral hidden inside the earth, something that must be dug up, counted carefully, and distributed reluctantly because there is only so much of it to go around. That is the fairy tale. The real world is colder than that. In the real world, the people closest to power have spent centuries proving that money is astonishingly flexible whenever their own stability requires it, and astonishingly scarce whenever everyone else's obedience requires it. That is the line. Once you see that line clearly, the entire moral story around poverty, work, merit, and wealth begins to change shape. I know people do not like hearing that. They prefer the old sermon: work hard, save diligently, respect the market, be patient, be prudent, do the right things, and the system will reward you. There is some truth in that, which is why the sermon survives. Discipline matters, patience matters, ownership matters, but the sermon leaves out the one thing that decides whether effort becomes freedom or merely prolonged exhaustion. It leaves out power. That omission is not an accident. It is the whole trick. Now, if you want to understand money at all, you have to go backward before you go forward. For much of early commercial history, the banker did not create value in the modern way people imagine finance works. He sat at the center of trust. Merchants moving goods across distance needed something better than dragging precious metals across roads, oceans, and violent borders. So gold would be left in one place, and a paper claim would move instead. That was the first elegant simplification. The paper represented the metal. Fine, nothing magical yet. But then somebody notices the obvious: the paper itself works. People are trading the claim. They are not actually asking for the gold every time. And once that realization arrives, a new world opens. The gold stays where it is. More claims are written against it. More commerce happens. More lending happens. More promises circulate than there is metal to settle all at once. This is where modern people are supposed to become shocked, as though the trick were unique to one era. It is not. This is one of the oldest habits in organized finance. The banking system discovers that money is not really about the thing sitting in the vault. It is about confidence in the claim. And once money becomes confidence plus power rather than metal plus restraint, the moral conversation around scarcity begins changing immediately, because now the question is no longer how much gold is there. The question becomes who gets to issue the claims. That is a much more important question, and once you ask it, you discover that money is never merely an economic subject. It is a political subject, it is a social subject, it is an obedience subject, it is an organizational subject. The right to create claims is the right to command labor without physically owning every field, tool, and worker yourself. That is what people miss. They keep looking at money and asking whether it is scarce. I look at money and ask who is allowed to make it feel scarce, and to whom those are very different questions. Now, a lot of people get nervous here and say something like this: if money can be created so flexibly, then why do we still have poverty? That is exactly the right question. It is one of the only serious questions. And the fact that most societies spend so much time distracting people from it tells you how dangerous the answer must be. Because if money is simply a social tool for organizing access to real things, and if the institutions at the center of finance can create, support, backstop, expand, or protect money whenever elite stability demands it, then the existence of chronic poverty begins looking less like an unfortunate technical accident and more like a design choice embedded in the system. That makes people uncomfortable. It should. But discomfort is not an argument. Let us reason it through carefully. We are constantly told that poverty exists because resources are scarce. There is not enough to go around. Somebody must work very hard because otherwise society cannot produce what it needs. Fine. Scarcity is real in one sense. Land is finite. Human attention is finite. The body is finite. Good locations are finite. Skilled labor is finite. Oil wells, copper mines, and wheat fields are not pure fantasy. I am not a child. I know the physical world has constraints, but that is not what the modern moral defense of poverty is actually saying. What it is really saying is that money must remain hard enough to obtain that most people keep organizing their lives around the chase for it. That is different. The argument is not merely about physical limits, it is about social discipline. That is the first mechanism. I call it manufactured urgency. You do not need people to fear the literal extinction of all resources. You need them to fear running short of claims on those resources. That is enough. If a person believes that falling behind in the money game means exposure, humiliation, instability, loss of dignity, and the inability to secure housing, food, health, transport, and social legitimacy, then he will work. He will compete, he will obey. He will price himself downward when necessary. He will compare himself against others instead of looking upward at the structure. He will call this realism. He will call it adulthood. He will tell his children the same thing. That is how the machine reproduces itself. People often speak about money as though its main function were exchange. That is true, but incomplete. Money is not only an exchange system, it is a command system. The person who controls the issuance, distribution, and terms of access to money is not simply managing neutral trade. He is managing who gets to feel secure and who must continue renting security from the future. And once you understand that, poverty begins to look different. Not like a random leftover from an otherwise rational system, more like one of the system's most useful features. Now, when I say useful, I do not mean noble. I mean useful to the people sitting closest to the levers. Poverty is socially useful if your objective is to keep labor available, anxious, disciplined, and eager to convert time into survival. This is why I get irritated when people speak as though the entire economic order is organized mainly to enrich everyone who participates well enough. It is not. It is organized to maintain a hierarchy of claims. At the top, large owners, institutions, and states gain broad freedom over time, capital, and optionality. Below them, the professional class lives better, but still under obligation. Below that, the wage class works under ever-tightening conditions, occasionally promised upward motion, often delivered only more expensive versions of stability. And at the bottom, visible poverty does a very important piece of cultural labor. It teaches fear. That is the second mechanism. I call it exemplary deprivation. A society does not merely tolerate poverty. It displays poverty. The point is not just that some people suffer. The point is that everybody else sees them suffer. Children see it. Workers see it. Families see it. Students see it. Immigrants see it. The middle class sees it and draws the intended conclusion. Do not fall, work harder, take the deal, accept the terms, stay employable, stay grateful, stay obedient. If visible deprivation did not exist, the money signal would lose some of its disciplinary force. That is what people do not like to admit. They like to think money motivates because abundance is attractive. That is only half the story. Money motivates because exclusion is frightening. And the more frightening exclusion becomes, the more desperate people are to remain inside the game, even when the game itself is becoming more fraudulent. Now let me say something else that will bother some people. Crises are not merely unfortunate interruptions to this system. They are also maintenance events inside it. This is where modern economies become almost comically misunderstood. A boom arrives, credit expands, asset prices rise, people feel wealthier, businesses overreach, speculators become bold, governments posture as though they have solved the problem of growth. Then something snaps, a financial crisis, a housing collapse, a recession, a market crash, a debt squeeze, and the public is told a very familiar story. The crash happened because greed went too far, because risk was mispriced, because some excess had to be corrected, because nobody saw it coming, because this is simply how markets cleanse themselves. There is truth there. But the deeper role of crisis is rarely explained honestly. Crisis restores discipline. That is what it does. It destroys claims. It wipes out weaker balance sheets. It throws people back into labor dependence. It terrifies households into caution. It reestablishes the emotional credibility of scarcity. It reminds everyone that money can disappear and therefore must be chased harder. That is the third mechanism. I call it periodic reintimidation. A population that has gone too long believing access is normal becomes harder to govern economically. A population that has recently watched access vanish becomes easier to manage. That is one reason the language after crises is always so revealing. People suddenly talk about prudence again, responsibility again, tightening belts again, living within our means again. It is as though the economy has a ritual vocabulary it must recite every time the public begins drifting too far into the belief that claims can be broad, stable, and widely shared. This is not to say every crisis is consciously designed by one villain in a dark room. I do not think history is that theatrical systems can produce stabilizing outcomes for elites without needing total conscious coordination at every step. That is how systems work. If the design rewards some results and punishes others, behavior converges, finance converges, policy converges, media explanation converges, and over time, the whole order starts behaving as though it were one intelligence, even when it is really 1,000 aligned incentives pushing in similar directions. Now, once you see that poverty and crisis perform disciplinary work, the next question arrives naturally. Why does money need to be treated as scarce if it is? In crucial ways, socially expandable. The answer is because what is really scarce is not money. What is scarce is legitimate access to ownership without prior ownership. That is the part almost nobody wants to discuss. We spend so much time talking about money that we forget what money is trying to buy. Claims on land, claims on housing, claims on business equity, claims on productive assets, claims on education, health, networks, location, and future stability. And as an economy matures, these claims get harder and harder for ordinary labor to acquire cleanly, especially if asset holders are already compounding faster than wages. That is the fourth mechanism. I call it the hidden scarcity shift. The public is taught to think money is scarce. The reality is that the system increasingly makes ownership scarce. Once the best land is already owned, the prime housing already owned, the best assets already capitalized, the strongest firms already priced for existing holders, then the new entrant is not really competing for neutral opportunity. He is competing for an admission ticket sold by those already inside. That is why work feels so strangely disconnected from wealth for so many ordinary people. Now they are still working. Society is still producing. Technology is still advancing, and yet the doorway to meaningful ownership seems to keep moving farther away. That is not their imagination. It is arithmetic. If asset prices rise faster than labor income for long enough, the wage earner is not climbing, he is chasing. And then the system has the arrogance to tell him he is morally weak for not running faster. I reject that story completely. Now, I want to bring this back to banking and central finance, because otherwise people will assume I have wandered off into pure social philosophy. I have not. The whole point of central banking, lender, of last resort functions, monetary expansion, reserve management, and financial stabilization architecture is not only to keep exchange functioning, it is to preserve the hierarchy of claims in a way that prevents total collapse while allowing the broad system of obedience through scarcity to continue. That is why money becomes suddenly flexible in moments of elite emergency. A bank fails. A sovereign credit event looms. A liquidity freeze threatens the core. And suddenly there is room. Emergency facilities, backstops, asset purchases, extraordinary lending, rule flexibility, public guarantees. What a miracle. The system that spent years telling ordinary people to be realistic, responsible, and accept limits discovers elasticity the instant serious holders are threatened. People say to me, that is just because systemic collapse would hurt everyone. Of course it would. That is not a rebuttal. That is exactly the point. The system knows how to create relief when necessary. What it does not do is normalize that relief for ordinary people in ways that would weaken the labor discipline of scarcity. That is the key distinction. Flexibility exists. It is selectively legitimized. This is why I say power turns nothing into everything. A central financial authority can expand claims at scale when the hierarchy needs protection. But broad access to that same flexibility is denied because broad access would change the behavior of labor. If everyone were genuinely secure, a great many unpleasant jobs would need to pay much more. A great many exploitative structures would weaken. A great many businesses would have to compete for labor under different terms. The system does not want that. It wants enough scarcity to keep the wheel turning and enough elasticity to save the wheel when it threatens to fly off the axle. That is the operational logic. Now, let us say something even less fashionable. War serves this system too. People hate hearing that because they want one clean story about war. War for resources, war for ideology, war for security, war for national honor. Fine, every war contains multiple motives. I am not interested in flattening history into one cause. But from a monetary and disciplinary perspective, war has always been extraordinarily useful to power. War destroys claims. War consumes surplus. War justifies control. War concentrates decision making. War reshapes labor obligations. War resets political language around sacrifice, rationing, loyalty, and emergency. War turns public attention away from domestic extraction and toward external threat. That is not incidental. That is functionality. Now, I am not saying all wars happen because elites woke up wanting to delete money for social discipline. History is more tangled than that. But I am saying that war reliably performs corrective and legitimizing functions for systems organized around controlled scarcity. And that is why war fits so easily into financial and political orders that otherwise claim to worship peace, efficiency, and abundance. This is the fifth mechanism. I call it violent reset. Once a system has too many unstable claims, too much political pressure, too much discontent, too much drift toward social demand, or too much internal contradiction, war and crisis can both act as events through which hierarchy is reasserted under the cover of necessity. Again, the point is not conspiracy theater. The point is structural usefulness, that is, the lens that matters. Now, a lot of people hear arguments like this and become fatalistic. They say, if money is a command system and poverty is useful to power, then nothing can be changed. That is the wrong conclusion. In fact, it is the conclusion the system would prefer you to draw because despair is more obedient than anger organized intelligently. The real conclusion is more demanding. You have to stop treating money as a moral reward and start treating it as a political instrument. That changes everything. Once money stops being sacred, you can ask adult questions. Who gets new claims first? Who benefits when money is loose? Who bears the cost when money becomes tight again? Who is rescued in crisis? Who is lectured in crisis? Who gets asset support? Who gets austerity? Who gets inflation, protected through ownership? Who gets wage erosion? Who is told to be patient? Who is told the market will eventually reward them if they remain responsible long enough? Those are the real questions, because they expose the distribution of flexibility. And the distribution of flexibility is the true constitution of the economy. Now I want to say something that will sound almost impolite coming from someone associated with investing. The richest people in the world often do not need money as much as they need everyone else to need money. That is the sixth mechanism. I call it dependency asymmetry. If I own enough assets, enough productive claims, enough land, enough equity, enough debt instruments, enough legal rights over revenue streams, then money for me becomes less about immediate survival and more about strategic optionality. For the ordinary worker, money remains survival. That gap is everything, because the person for whom money is optional lives psychologically in a different universe than the person for whom money is oxygen. And political systems built around that split can maintain extraordinary levels of inequality while still preaching individual freedom. Because freedom means radically different things depending on whether money is your bargaining chip or your life support. This is why I never reduce poverty to merely not enough money. Poverty is insufficient command over your own time and over the terms on which you must sell yourself into the system. That is what makes it so brutal. You are not simply lacking consumption. You are lacking leverage. And leverage is what determines whether you negotiate with society or merely obey it. Now, can society abolish poverty in the crude sense of giving everyone endless money claims? Of course not in some childish absolute way. If you tried to expand claims infinitely without organizing real production, distribution, energy, housing, health, and logistics, you would quickly create chaos, inflationary distortion, or a different form of power struggle. But that is not the same thing as saying current poverty levels are natural. They are not. Current poverty is managed, current scarcity is administered, current deprivation is politically tolerated because it performs useful work in the system we have. That is the seventh mechanism. I call it selective impossibility. People are told that broad security is impossible. Then they watch impossible sums appear for banks, wars, rescues, collapses, asset markets, and emergency facilities. What they are really being shown is not impossibility. They are being shown hierarchy. This is what enrages people once they see it clearly enough. Not that money can move. That money moves easily for power and reluctantly for dignity. And dignity is the word I care about most here. Because once you understand poverty as something done through systems rather than merely something that happens to weak individuals, the moral frame changes. The poor are not merely the losers in a neutral contest. They are often the ones carrying the burden of a design whose central aim is not abundance for all, but stability of hierarchy. That does not mean every poor person made no bad decisions. It means bad decisions are not the whole story, and often not even the main story. It means the public must stop confusing visible suffering with individual moral failure. That confusion is how hierarchy survives ethically. Now let me close this the way I think Buffett ought to close it. The real value in any society is not money. The real value is what people do. The work, the care, the building, the teaching, the growing, the repairing, the hauling, the coding, the nursing, the cleaning, the driving, the maintaining, the endless web of human effort that turns a dead map into a living civilization. Money is supposed to organize claims on that effort. The tragedy is that once money becomes sufficiently centralized, abstract, and politically protected, the organizing tool starts masquerading as the source of value itself, and then everything gets reversed. The people who already own claims over the system begin appearing as though they created the whole thing. The people whose labor actually keeps it alive begin appearing replaceable. That is upside down. And poverty is one of the main devices by which that upside down order keeps reproducing itself. If you want a healthier society, you do not begin by worshiping money harder. You begin by seeing money clearly. A claim, a command, a permission slip, a social technology, not a god. And once enough people see it that way, they can start asking the real political question. If money can be expanded to save power, why is it treated as untouchably scarce when the issue is human dignity? That is the question behind all the others. Why austerity? Why wages lag? Why work intensifies? Why housing excludes? Why people are told there is no alternative? The answer is not that alternatives are unimaginable. The answer is that hierarchy has preferences. And once you know that, you stop asking why the world is irrational. You start asking who the current form of rationality is serving. That is where the real conversation begins, not with money, with power. Money just happens to be one of its favorite masks.